We've just finished up the discussion of what he does with the family and why, so we know that he takes apart the traditional view of the family and the idea of divine right drawn from, the grant God gave Adam. So then what does he do with God? Well, it's interesting what he does with God, and he does, as you've no doubt noticed, give you lots of biblical citations. And in my notes there I have Romans 13. That would be, maybe it's the previous one. Yeah. But actually, I went and I looked again, and he actually doesn't cite Romans 13 here. He must do it elsewhere, because I remember that. But it's kind of surprising he doesn't, because Romans 13 basically says, you owe allegiance to, whoever the sovereign is. You have a duty to obey. But there's also this dual message of, well, you owe allegiance to God for what God is and who God is, but you also owe allegiance to the sovereign. It may be he steered away from that, because that does kind of sound like your allegiance depends on what it is, what the subject is. In religion, you owe it to God, and he doesn't want to say that. But he'll find all sorts of biblical citations to try to support his point, which is that though he disagrees with the divine right theory, he does want to link God up with whomever is in power. And his argument is, since we all say God is sovereign and creator of the universe, the cause of all things, then of course he must be the cause of this as well, right? The cause of whomever happens to be sitting on the throne. And that's a different route to it. It's a different route to linking God up with the sovereign. It basically eliminates the possibility of people using God's word to judge the sovereign. Okay? And it actually sort of aligns with sometimes the medieval writers would say, if you have a bad sovereign, you got to consider it God's scourge, God's punishment. In either case, it comes from God. So he sort of lines up with that perspective here. No matter what you have, it's God's will. So that's very tidy, okay? And then I want to talk about this issue of, is there ever a point where you can resist the sovereign? Okay. Well, actually, interestingly, there is really one issue that will justify resistance to the sovereign. I'm sure you know what it is, right? By now?
If the sovereign asks you to hurt yourself.
Yeah, in any way, right? Or puts you in harm's way. You have absolutely no obligation to hurt yourself or to put yourself in harm's way. Because after all, the contract is for your physical safety. That's what it's for. So that's the one case where naturally you're going to do whatever it takes to make yourself safe, right? So this is why he says covenants or agreements not to defend man's own body are void. And that's in chapter 21. He says on the right-hand column of page 191, second paragraph, if the sovereign commands a man, though justly condemned, to kill, wound, or maim himself, or not to resist those that assault him, or to abstain from the use of food, air, medicine, or any other thing without which he cannot live, yet hath that man the liberty to disobey. Okay? Can you see why he has to say this? Survival is the basis of the social contract. He cannot say that you have a duty to hurt yourself, because he's based the entire social contract on self-preservation. So even if, in other words, even if the sovereign sends out his police to arrest you, okay, if you can escape, you have a right to escape. Does this surprise you that he would put this stuff in here?
I mean, a little bit with how much he says, the sovereign is the, ultimate power. You have to obey everything the sovereign does, unless he's hurting you. but that kind of defeats the purpose of, having punishment at all, and having the sovereign be able to punish you at all if it's going to hurt you.
Yeah, it's going to hurt you, right?
It is a little contradictory.
It seems like it, he's trying to be
But I get what
extremely
he
consistent.
means, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Does this extend to, how it says to abstain from the use of food, air, medicine, or any other thing without which you cannot live? Does that include like how in France they were not doing very well economically because the king was not?
Mm-hmm.
Does that include that?
Excellent
kind of
question.
thing?
Excellent
or
question.
how far does that extend out?
Well, and see, this is the problem. In Hobbes's mind, he's probably thinking, if the sovereign captures you and throws you into a pit or a dungeon and deprives you of food and water, right, because you have disobeyed him or whatever, you have the right to try to get out, to try to get food or whatever you need any way you can. He's probably not thinking of the instance of if the sovereign is simply terrible and has created a terrible economy and people are starving. However, later on, and I can show you where this is, I have it listed here for a reason. On 246, we'll just jump ahead momentarily. He does kind of hint that though, he wouldn't want to encourage people to think this way, i.e., I'm going to rebel because the sovereign's starving us. Nevertheless, on 246, up at the top left, he says, having thus briefly spoke of the natural kingdom of God and his natural laws, I will add only this chapter, a short declaration of his, that's God's, natural punishments. There is no action of a man in this life that is not the beginning of so long a chain of consequences, as no human providence is high enough to give a man a prospect to the end. And in this chain, there are linked together both pleasing and unpleasing events, in such manner as he that will do anything for his pleasure must engage himself to suffer all the pains annexed to it. And these pains are the natural punishments of those actions which are the beginning of more harm than good. And hereby it comes to pass that, and he's speaking of the sovereign here, intemperance is naturally punished with diseases, rashness with mischances, injustice with the violence of enemies, pride with ruin, cowardice with oppression, negligent government of princes with rebellion, and rebellion with slaughter. So if you rebel, watch out, you're probably going to be killed. But he mentions negligent government of princes, which would be what you're talking about. So he's not going to tell people you have a right to resist under these circumstances of bad government. Nowhere in here, But this is the one spot that I can remember where he comes close, and it seems like he's aiming his comments at the sovereign, basically saying, despite the fact that, I'm saying people should obey and people should never risk the slaughter that comes with rebellion. Nevertheless, if you are bad enough, you may still get rebellion, okay? So he says, foreseeing punishments are the consequence to the breach of laws. Natural punishments must naturally consequent to the breach of the laws of nature. And this is the only way that a sovereign would ever be punished for his bad decisions, would be if people just can't stand it anymore and rebel anyway, right? So my answer to your question is no and yes, right? You will never see him emphasizing this. He wants to do the opposite. He doesn't want to say, people, judge your government if you aren't being fed well enough, or you're not, if you feel like you're in desperate straits. Remember that rebellion and civil war is even worse. You think you've got it bad now, you could die tomorrow if you try this. But at the same time, if the government is for your survival, and he makes that abundantly clear, that's the whole basis for it. It's only natural for people to think like you just said, that what if the government is mistreating us? What if the government is so bad, like North Korea, okay, where people are starving? Is that not an assault upon your self-preservation. Well, yeah, but he's never going to encourage rebellion. Whereas Locke takes very similar reasoning and does encourage it. Yeah.
Would Hobbes's whole view of how the government should be the absolute power, could that largely stem from the fact that he was treated very well by the monarchy? And he was more upper class, like he wasn't lower class working.
He wasn't lower class, no. He was sort of a hanger-on to the upper class. He didn't have noble blood himself, but he was always associated with the noble family as a secretary, as some sort of servant, as somebody who they sponsored and listened to. So he was one of those people. And a lot of intellectuals, that's how they survived at this time. They attached themselves to some noble family. And he ended up, yes, being associated with the monarchy. And yes, he did have fond feelings towards them. He went with him into exile, Charles II, tutored him, supported him, came back with him, right? So it probably didn't hurt his perspective of the value that he placed on that. And while he was in France looking over his country and seeing that, there was no real conclusion to the turmoil until they brought the king back. They thought that they would be able to establish a better government with parliamentary rule and some sort of republicanism, but they never could get there, and they ended up substituting a king for a dictator with Oliver Cromwell, okay? And so he's looking at this going, well, that certainly isn't better than what we had. And that's the way that Hobbes thinks. He thinks, what's the worst thing that could happen? Not what's the best thing or what's the optimal thing, but what's the worst thing that could happen, because it probably will. Yeah, I know, it kind of makes sense, but it's very pessimistic. And Locke basically takes the position that there are some things that are worth dying for, that there are some things that are worth risking your life for, because you really don't want to live with what he would call slavery. If you have absolute obedience to a sovereign, no matter what they do to you, tell you how to worship, run the economy into the ground, if you don't have the basics of life and you are worried about your survival and you don't have any freedom, maybe it's worth risking your life to right that for future generations. That's what he says. Hobbes is very, very basic. It's not worth it if you die.
Yeah.
That's it. That's it.
So he doesn't encourage rebellion, but he says it's possible. Is that
Yes.
kind of a way of putting it?
Right. And he's warning the sovereign. The only laws that really ever apply to the sovereign are natural laws. He's not bound by his own written law at all. But the natural laws are laws that simply make sense for survival and peace and so forth. And so, yes, nature punishes you. And so he's warning the sovereign there. He doesn't do that a lot, because he certainly doesn't want to encourage people to look at the sovereign in this way. But he's saying, these natural laws, they're words of wisdom for you, to follow. Let's look at a little bit more of the reasoning here. Down at the bottom of 191, he says, no man is bound by the words themselves, either to kill himself or any other man. That's interesting. Not any other man, too. So if you're told by the sovereign you're the executioner, you can resist that as well, because he says he can always find somebody else. The obligation a man may have sometimes upon the command of the sovereign to execute any dangerous or dishonorable office dependeth not on our words of submission, but on the intention which is to be understood by the end thereof. And when therefore our refusal to obey frustrates the end for which the sovereignty was ordained, then there is no liberty to refuse, otherwise there is. Okay, so if by refusing we will bring more danger and chaos upon our society, then we are doing so wrongly. But if he can easily find some other way to achieve his objectives, you can refuse. Now, that doesn't mean that the sovereign can't come after you and punish you for refusal. He's not saying that, okay? He's simply saying, if you, in your mind, you calculate, okay. For instance, if you're a soldier, which is what he talks about next, and you're told, go into this town and kill everybody, and you think, that is likely to get me killed. If not today, then tomorrow, when, revenge. And so, no, I'm not going to do this. He can refuse. Now, what he'd want to do is try to get away and escape, because the sovereign will send his men after people who refuse. And he has a right to do that too, and if he can capture them, kill them. So, but you have that, basically you're a free agent in that situation, right? In any sort of violent situation, you've got to decide what is the best route to keep me alive today and tomorrow. And if that means disobeying, then disobey, but you're taking your chances, and so you need to leave, right? Again, very, very basic. You can't really, in a violent situation, there is no way, literally no way, that you can force a person to do what they don't want to do, okay? It's all a matter of the consequences later on. So then he gets to warfare, which is really crucial, because if, in order to have a sovereign power be safe and secure, you have to have a military, right? You have to have national defense. But he has to be consistent. And he says, upon this ground, a man that is commanded as a soldier to fight against the enemy, though his sovereign have right enough to punish his refusal with death, may nevertheless in many cases refuse without injustice, as when he substitutes a sufficient soldier in his place, which actually, that was a common occurrence. You could hire yourself a mercenary to take your place if you were called up, if you had enough money to do that. For in this case, he deserts not the service of the Commonwealth. And there is to be made a case for natural timorousness, which is fearfulness, okay? Not only to women, of whom no such dangerous duty is expected, but also to men of feminine courage. This is interesting language because, and you could really pick this apart, but it seems to me that he's applying just a little bit of shaming here, okay? He's saying, in this situation, allowances are to be made for men who are fearful, which of course happens constantly and isn't necessarily cowardice. But by using this language, does any man want to be accused of having feminine courage? No. So he's saying here, this behavior is shameful, right? You shouldn't feel proud of it, but it is also natural in this situation, right? When armies fight, there is on one side or both a running away. Yet when they do it not out of treachery but fear, they are not esteemed to do it unjustly, but dishonorably. Okay? Again, that's a shaming, honor versus shame, right? So you're being dishonorable, but not unjust. For the same reason, to avoid battle is not injustice, but cowardice. Shameful, right? But he that enrolleth himself, now this is interesting, he that enrolleth himself as a soldier, that is, if he volunteers, or takes impressed money, if he's a mercenary, taketh away the excuse of a cowardly or timorous nature, and is obliged not only to go to the battle, but also not to run from it without his captain's leave. I don't see how that could be enforced.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting language. Applying Hobbes's prior logic, even if you're paid or you volunteered, if you're about to die, how can you be obliged to stay? So this is, I think Hobbes is struggling here because he knows that if his teaching encourages people to not join or to run away or to desert the military, then you don't have a sovereign country. You can't, right? You have to give these men the impression that they must stand and fight and not run away. But he also knows that if he says that absolutely, he contradicts his whole rationale for the social contract. So this is a really difficult spot for him. If that social contract is for your self-preservation, how can you be made to risk your life? It's a tough one, and it sort of hangs there, okay? And he's hoping, I think, that the honor-shame, dynamic, which is there, especially for men, that will make most of them stay and fight under these circumstances. But, and they did. I mean, they did and they do. But if you were taught this, which Hobbes wants to teach, government is for you, the individual, and your self-preservation, if that was really ground into your head, it might make it less likely to have that, because you have to have patriotism, you have to have a strong sense of bonding with the other people you're fighting with. You have to have a sense that you're doing the right thing, that it's something worth dying for, because if you die, at least your family will be safe and future generations. You have to have all that in your mind to be able to stay there and do that. Locke understands this, and he actually says things like that though you may die in this rebellion, that you will be preserving the freedoms of your family and their children, not to mention your property and the source of their prosperity, etc., etc. Hobbes can't do that. He doesn't make that strong an appeal, but he is making somewhat appeal to, how many men want to be accused of cowardice.
He's basically just coming out and saying that if you don't go out and fight, you're a coward.
You're a coward.
Yeah.
But I can't
say it
say
to anything.
Yeah, right, exactly. Not you're being smart because, or you're smarter if you stay. Either way, he's saying you're a coward. It's shameful. However, it's justifiable. No one can stop you. And back then, it was even easier to get lost by a lot than it would be now. So I think, routinely men just simply deserted and got lost. I mean, can you imagine how hard it would be to track guys down in that situation? You could just leave and disappear. So it was far easier to do. And if you don't, shame doesn't apply. It's not clear to me that Hobbes is talking about internal shame here. He's talking about the view of other people. Right? Mm-hmm. And that doesn't apply if you left the scene and relocated. Okay? All right, so there's that. That's a problem. All right. Guess I already moved on. So let's talk a little bit about the sovereign's power and what the sovereign should do in order to keep order. Well, he argues that many forms of private activity ought to be regulated or outlawed, okay? And so he goes into a lot of details. I'm sure you noticed what should be looked at very carefully, what should not be allowed. Now, he does want to allow most free economic activity. That's very important, right? That people be relatively free to pursue trade. In fact, he wants people to concentrate on their private lives and their private well-beings and not meddle in the business of government. But he does say that if any business becomes too powerful, if it becomes a monopoly, then that shouldn't be lawful, because then that business could gain too much political power. Okay? So somewhat similar to our concerns that you hear voiced today about the power of major corporations, right? And their political influence. If they have sole control over a very crucial commodity, this is particularly troublesome because they can disrupt the entire economy and they can actually cause harm to the sovereign's power. Okay? He says on the bottom right of 196, of this double monopoly, one part is disadvantageous to the people at home, the other to foreigners, for at home, by their sole exportation, they set what price they please on the husbandry and handiworks of the people. and by the sole importation what price they please on all foreign commodities. So there's the economic impact. You don't want that. And isn't it interesting that even in the United States, in a very different form of government, we have antitrust laws, and this is recognized that if you have a monopoly, it needs to be broken up, because otherwise it becomes a detriment to the economy. There's no competition, and there's too much power, too much control. Okay, so that's one area where there needs to be constant vigilance and regulation. But there's a lot of other areas too which we might not agree about. One is parties, political parties, okay? And clubs.
I like how I called them leagues.
Yes, leagues, right. That basically people get together and form these groups that want to agree. Well, Americans do that all the time, right? I just had somebody ask me to join another one. And I said, I don't think so. I just got out of one league. I don't want to get into another one. But they form, interest groups about everything. And of course, we have multiple parties, even though we have two major parties.
So
we've got a lot
they
more.
should be regulated.
They should be outlawed,
Outlawed,
actually.
okay.
They should be outlawed. As soon as you find people starting to, form these groups, you should outlaw them. Factions and assemblies. So you watch your parliament, and if you see people beginning to collude in smaller groups and plan and try to gain allies, that should be outlawed. Okay? That would have gotten rid of the problem there with the English Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did Madison pull off of Hobbes at all?
Well, in a way he did. Madison was informed by Hobbes, and he understood the problem that Hobbes is talking about with faction, and he agreed that faction, either in the people or in the legislature, can cause a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm.
He handled it in a different way, but he definitely did agree faction is a problem. It's not necessarily good, and there's a lot of factions, particularly class-based factions and religious-based factions, that can become a huge problem. So he came up with the solution of the large republic, the factions based upon more or less not economic class, but economic activity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not something that Hobbes would have ever thought would work, right?
Mm-hmm.
He would have thought, yes, anytime you get people strongly identifying with anything other than the unity of the country, you've got a problem. Yeah, you're right though. Faction is a concern that goes way back, and he would have definitely tapped into Hobbes's thought. Another concern is rich people who become almost like small countries unto themselves. These would be the nobles with their vast estates and lots of money to hire so-called servants. Hobbes calls them servants, but they really be,
Like bodyguards.
yeah, I mean, the whole feudal, setup, knights, vassals, right?
Mm-hmm.
More or less bodyguards, yes. Or you might even call them private armies if they got big enough. And in the past, the way that feudalism worked was the king would have to deal with these nobles who represented somewhat independent sources of power, and he would have to sort of stay on their good side or threaten them or do whatever it took to keep them in line. And then if he wanted to wage war, he'd have to get their support, okay, for money, for their military power and so forth. Hobbes wants to get totally away from that system. You should not have people within your country that have military and political power of their own. So there goes federalism and all that, divided power that we have. Back then, it would have been, and actually the feudal system was somewhat the model for the idea of divided power and separation of powers, believe it or not. The Magna Carta being the first document that established this notion of relationship between king and nobles, and some shared power, some rights for the nobles and their people. So again, Hobbes is saying, nope, no divided power here, and especially not people with arms, because they can decide to fight against you, or they can decide to ally themselves with another kingdom, right? And then you've got an enemy. And why would the sovereign want to go and beg for money, as he had to do to fight the Parliament? Charles I had to go to his nobles and hope that they would, and they did, because they could see that in this case they were also threatened. But what if they saw in this an opportunity? Then maybe not. So sovereign power should never be, it's not sovereign, first of all, when it has these others out there. And it should never be in the position of having to go and ask for assistance. So get rid of those, which means probably taking their property, means disarming them. And by the way, Machiavelli actually recommended this too, so Hobbes may be drawing from Machiavelli. And then religious factions, obvious, right? We don't want to have all of these different branches of Protestantism. We don't want to have the Catholics, which are the papists, and all of these people able to speak their mind and worship or not worship as they choose, because this just creates just conflict, disagreement, okay? So you should have one official church, and people ought to be made to support it through their taxes, and they ought to be made to attend it, okay? So far, do you think this would lead to peace? I mean, if you could actually accomplish this and have this level of control over people?
If you could accomplish this would be incredible.
So,
it's very tough to do.
Yeah, it would be incredible in the sense of peace?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think so, because, well, for one thing, I mean, I think you can outlaw this, but I mean, people are going to meet in secrecy, I think, and have their own secret factions. So I think, like, to the public, though, it would get pretty close to peace.
Okay.
Within your own commonwealth, I would say, because I mean, this is the reason for conflict, mostly. Mostly, so.
Yeah, that's a good point, that you can't outlaw what you can't see,
yeah.
right?
And
So,
then that's the issue. I think that people would still meet in secret.
you'd have to make people awfully afraid of being found out in order to discourage that kind of behavior, wouldn't you? Right?
I think in like today this would not work. Just no, that wouldn't work today. But
Right.
back then, when people were less educated, they didn't have the freedoms that we have today. Like that, it may have worked, but like he said, you can't stop people from meeting in secret. You can't, I guess, weed out all of the crime and stuff. It's a lot to go through, and you'd have to be a very, very feared leader for it to even come close to work.
Yes, I think that's right. For people to worry about what they would do in their own
really need to
home.
fear you.
Which at that point would probably actually drive more people to join in on the secret meetings and that kind of thing.
But
It might.
at this point, according to Hobbes, you should already be feared by your people, essentially. So then, I guess, I don't know.
You should be strong.
Yeah.
But of course, he knows that people are oftentimes rash and foolish, and they don't always fear when they should. And he's basically told us that. So this is really difficult. Now with religion, later on in that part on the Christian Commonwealth, he does say that no one can force you to think this way, right? And in your own home, to worship God as you please. Okay, so he does acknowledge there's only so far that the sovereign can reach. He hasn't anticipated totalitarianism, which is basically, attempts to actually more or less propagandize people into actually agreeing. But if you start to have people over, if it becomes obvious that there are people meeting at your home, all of which the sovereign's people should be able to see, then they will find out, they will investigate. So there's very, very little you can do, right, other than go home and with your own family worship in the privacy of your own home. And you seem to indicate that people would get angry about that. And I think that that's probably right.
Maybe not. angry necessarily. I guess it would depend on how, not necessarily how strict, but how much in secret you would have to do something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Like if it was, you could only do it like in the dead of night, windows and blinds closed, lights off, like, and you had to be like quiet, and you couldn't do like
Yeah.
if you had to be very, very secretive about it, I feel like people would just get frustrated with it eventually, just because it's like, well, I mean, everybody else is doing the same thing. They're all going home worshiping their own, worshiping in their own way. Why is it not a thing that we can worship
My
in
thing
public
is-
when everybody's going home to worship their own way
Yeah, my
anyways?
thing is like, would this happen like if everybody was having all these private groups and everybody started to find out about it, everybody just come out public with everything at once and be like, no, we're doing things this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially
We're having our own views on this.
especially since it's about the most important thing for a lot of people is the salvation of their souls. This is the most important thing, and it is difficult to argue to them that their physical lives are more important than the welfare of their eternal souls, right? And Hobbes does understand this. He's hoping that through the establishment of the official church and getting people to go there, that over time, I think, people will simply become comfortable with that and will not go home and do their private thing, and that over time you will get more actual uniformity. But, he understands that this is the most difficult thing, is to get people to think in terms of survival of the physical body versus the soul. He does the very best he can, but I'm not sure he gets that job done. And this is why Locke comes along not much later and has a different solution, because he realizes you really can't. Locke comes right out and says, you can't tell people for whom their eternal soul is the most important thing to not speak about it, to not want to worship as they please, and ask other people to join them, right? What you have to do instead is have this toleration, which is a whole new concept for people, the idea that you should tolerate, meaning not love, accept, and embrace, but simply allow other people to do something very different than what you do in matters of worship is a mind-blowing idea, right? That Hobbes clearly didn't think was possible, but Locke really tries to sell it, and the way that he does it will be very interesting. He tries to get people to think, first of all, of peace, but secondly, that the differences that we have in matters of religion are not as huge as we think they are, and that maybe, radically, people of different faiths may actually be able to get to heaven. It's an interesting argument, a very, very modern argument when we get there. So,
I guess I have another quick question. Would Hobbes rebuttal in a sense to that, saying that, no, I mean, under the sovereign, everybody should have the same view, because, I mean, what he wants, I guess, is what it should be. It's kind of an endless loop in a way, but, I mean, is that what he would say to that?
he would say that Locke cannot get peace through toleration. He would doubt whether people could be trained to tolerate. And he would say, when you have the Baptists worshiping over here, trying to recruit the Presbyterians over here, trying to recruit the Catholics and the Jews and so forth, you're gonna end up having factions form, and it's gonna lead to conflict. Mm-hmm. So, because people can't be convinced to live and let live. He just didn't think it was possible. So what we have to do is just create at least external uniformity so that people can't see the differences. Hopefully over time the differences will go away. So he just didn't think it was possible, But Locke was a generation or so later, and by then there was so much religious diversity that there was no way he could even imagine bringing back any level of uniformity. So then what do? You have to give people a reason to tolerate, and it's got to go beyond simply survival. This is why Locke makes the argument that We don't know, he says, we don't know what God will accept. We're not God. So therefore, we really can't judge whether other people are doing what they should or whether they're going to be acceptable to God or not. It's really interesting. And he wants that to be taught to people. He wants that to be the way people think. And it has happened over time in the Western world. We do think that way now. They didn't back then. You know, even in Locke's time, especially with Catholics and Jews, okay, it was, you know, they really ought not to be allowed to exist. And if they do exist, we're going to persecute them. Okay. Well, let's see. I was just going to ask you that we may not get to those next slides, so we might have to do that on Wednesday and Friday. But just to kind of wrap up this discussion of our own situation with relative to private activity. Obviously, in the United States, we have a much freer system than Hobbes envisioned back then, and yet there are questions that arise about where our government or a government like ours should draw the line with private activity as well. Because there is a point where sovereignty is important for any country, okay? So while we may allow political groups like the Tea Party and the Green Party and the various, and even the Socialist Party, are there political groups such as fascists or hardline communists that should be outlawed? Right now, no, actually, that's not our policy, right? We have skinheads, we have neo-Nazis, we have people who are hardline communists, not very many, but the government doesn't take aim. Is there any argument to be made for doing, like, say, Germany? Germany has outlawed fascism. They will not tolerate, they still have them, but they'll arrest them and they'll throw them in jail. Okay. Is there a good reason for doing that? Or is it better to leave it the way it is here?
I can see both sides.
I can definitely see why they do it in Germany, but
Well, yeah, Germany's
yeah,
a special case.
Yeah, but here, I mean, I don't.
Here, I wouldn't really see the point in outlawing it because they're, in the grand scheme of everyone, there aren't actually that many.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, you know, just taking away the rights of those very, very few not only makes our government look bad just because there's so few of them, they can't really do much unless they start gaining a following.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
What happens if they do?
Yeah.
Or what happens if they have a compound set up and they've armed themselves with enough ammo to hurt other people?
Well,
generally though, those
that's
kinds
what I
of
was
groups
thinking.
are pretty extreme
Mm-hmm.
in their views, which the majority of the population is very in the middle
Mm-hmm.
and not extremes, but not saying that there's not any. Just, I don't know, that's kind of a tough call to make.
Do you remember the story? You probably don't. You were probably kids, but there was a group called the Branch Davidians down in Waco, Texas. They were a sort of odd religious group, and they got themselves into a compound with lots of guns.
Are they a cult?
They were a cult, yes, and they had enough weaponry that the ATF was alerted and decided that they should not be allowed to be there, holed up in this compound, seemingly threatening others. Okay, they were concerned about women and children in the situation, how they were being treated, and so the ATF actually went in there and ended up, it was kind of tragic, they ended up in assaulting the compound and ended up blowing the place up. A lot of people died in the process, and it was very controversial because, you know, that this question arose: where do we draw the line? When does a group become a threat to the peace? Even though they weren't doing anything at the moment, they had lots and lots of guns, they were holed up, they looked like they might, who knows what they were doing.
That could scare like the overall majority though, so I could see why you would maybe want to regulate that. I mean, just the thought of a group having all that weaponry.
Mhm.
Be kind of frightening to a lot of people in the area.
And not knowing what they were
Yeah,
going
what
to
they're
do.
doing,
This
yeah.
was the idea, was that we don't know what they're going to do with all of this. There's a presumption that if a group arms themselves up to the level of actually being able to do combat, that they might have the intention of doing combat.
Yeah, exactly.
So then, you know, how do we treat them? Well, the sad part there were a lot of women and children in there with them, and it didn't turn out well. And then in the aftermath of that, the questions were really, should we have handled this differently? Not should we have stopped them, because most people agreed, yes, we had to do something about it, but how it was done. You know, should we have waited? Was there an immediate threat there, etc. So occasionally we have these. We also have religious factions that cross our laws, okay, or almost cross our laws, right? Right. Like the Christian Scientists and other groups that don't believe in medical treatment. And it's okay for adults to refuse medical treatment, but the issue comes when they refuse medical treatment for their children. If the child's dying of cancer, has some, you know, something that is threatening their lives. You know what? I think the Supreme Court, I'll have to check it, but I think the Supreme Court has ruled that the state has an interest in the child's welfare. And they have and can and have basically removed those children. But it's always, you know, whenever you see one of these cases, it's always a tough call. And a lot of time they err on the side of the parents' authority.
There was one a while back where a girl, I think she had leukemia, and she was like 15, 16, and she wanted treatment and her mother wouldn't let her, and they did decide to let the mother say, no, you're not treating my child.
Because she is the mother of the,
Yeah, but she's like 15, 16 years old. It's like
close to being an emancipated minor if she wanted to
Yeah.
be. Yeah, that's probably the wrong call, right? When a person has the ability to reason for themselves. But that's how difficult this is. We want families, parents, to have that autonomy and authority over their own family, especially on religious matters. You don't want to tell people what they can and can't believe, but yet here's this other human which basically hasn't had a free choice as an adult as to what to believe, right? They've been brought up this way. Same thing with Mormons that go their way with polygamy still. You know, we don't do that in this country, but there are some cases of it. All right, so just something to think about. And next time, bring this back in and we'll start up on this stuff, okay? With what causes crime.